Good evening. Welcome to Straight Talk. This is Eugene Chan, and our guest tonight is Mr. Richard Lancaster. He's the chairman of the Business Environment Council and also the CEO of CLP Group. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Eugene.
Yeah, we're going to talk about climate change and whether all the policies are going to help us to tackle the climate crisis. As you know, the word climate change is a very commonly heard name now, say on the news, and even for companies, whether it's large or small, they talk about this all the time. As a consumer, it comes in all walks of life. So what has climate change got to do with us in Hong Kong? And tell us all about it. I think you're the expert.
Well, I wouldn't say I'm an expert, but I have been involved in climate change through my role in the electricity sector and also through my role in the Business Environment Council in Hong Kong. Essentially, there's a lot of terms that we hear: climate change, greenhouse gases, carbon emissions, carbon neutrality, and sometimes it is very confusing. But essentially, the issue is that burning fossil fuels, when I say fossil fuels, I mean oil, natural gas, and coal. When you burn those, they release carbon into the atmosphere. When you release enough carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, it creates what's called the greenhouse effect.
Right.
So it traps heat. The sunlight comes into the Earth and it gets reflected off the Earth, but it gets trapped there. So the planet warms up. And if you keep producing carbon dioxide, the planet will get warmer and warmer and warmer. What happens with that is that as the temperature rises, the ocean expands. You start to get melting of ice caps and mountain glaciers, and that will cause flooding, it will cause water shortages. The storms that we see, the typhoons that we see on a seasonal basis come from the energy trapped in the ocean. So we will get stronger storms. And as the sea level starts to rise in parts of the world such as Asia, where we have such intense population density, we will find that the land is squeezed and we'll get even greater population issues. So this is very much an issue for us living right in the heart of Asia.
Right, but say for Hong Kong, what will be the most significant contributor to so-called the greater picture of climate change? What will be the thing in Hong Kong?
Well, Hong Kong is is really a part of a global community that is all trying to tackle climate change. In order to tackle climate change, we have to stop burning fossil fuels. We have to find other ways of producing the energy that we need in our society. Now, as a representative economy, Hong Kong contributes around 65% of Hong Kong's carbon dioxide emissions come from electricity generation.
Right.
We don't have a lot of industry in Hong Kong. So the electricity generation is the major source of carbon dioxide emissions. Another big source is transportation. So the cars that we use, the goods that we transport, all of that produces carbon dioxide. And if you add all of that up, around 83% of Hong Kong's carbon dioxide emissions just come from those two sectors alone.
Right.
Now, the good news is that electricity can be produced without releasing carbon dioxide. There are various technologies, many of these are well proven and very economic, that can easily make electricity switch to carbon-free forms of production. And once electricity is carbon-free, it can then be used as a carbon-free energy source for electric vehicles, for example. So there are solutions. By changing the way that we produce energy, changing the way that we use energy, there are solutions which will enable Hong Kong to become a carbon-free economy. And Hong Kong, as part of the global community, needs to do its part, just as every other country in the world needs to find its own solutions as well.
Yeah, since you mentioned the word global, I was just thinking for the global perspective. We also read in the news in April, the U.S. climate convoy, John Kerry, met with our Chinese ambassador on this environment conference, Xi Jinping, in Shanghai recently. And also last year in September, President Xi Jinping has said the country will aim to have carbon neutrality by 2060 and the peak carbon emission by 2030. And in last year's policy address for the Hong Kong SAR, Mrs. Kerry did mention a similar goal of having committed to have of carbon neutrality by 2050, and we have action plans sometime this year by the Secretary Wong Kam-sing. Maybe we hear what Mrs. Lam has to say to us.
Combating climate change is an important issue across the globe. In his speech delivered to the United Nations earlier on, President Xi Jinping made it clear that China would endeavor to achieve the peak of carbon emissions in 2030 and carbon neutrality before 2060. This is an important commitment made by our country in combating climate change and is well received by governments and international environmental groups around the world. In Hong Kong, the Council for Sustainable Development just submitted a report to the government on long-term decarbonization strategy. I now announce that the Hong Kong SAR will strive to achieve carbon neutrality before 2050.
Richard, so the roadmap has been drawn up. Do you think our country will be able to meet the objective in time? And what are the major challenges and risks that we will face?
Well, China has set a target to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. The Hong Kong government has set a target to achieve that by 2050, 10 years earlier.
Yes.
And Hong Kong being a relatively small place with relatively little industrial activity in our economy should be able to achieve carbon neutrality earlier than the rest of China.
Right.
China has a very large industrial base. It is starting from a position where it's primarily using coal as an energy source. However, China has invested in the industrial capability to really facilitate a decarbonized electricity sector. Around 70% of the world's solar panels, for example, are all manufactured in China. Similarly, around 50% of the world's electric cars are manufactured in China. So that industrial base, once it is scaled up and once electric cars are on the roads in China, once solar panels are being more widely deployed, then that will enable China to rapidly decarbonize its electricity sector. In Hong Kong, we have different choices. We are located in a much more confined area. We are much closer to the equator than many parts of China, so the natural resources are different here. So we will have our own solutions, but I believe that Hong Kong can be decarbonized by 2050 in line with the Chief Executive's target.
So what you're saying is, for the mainland, I think the challenges is greater than Hong Kong because we are more of a confined sort of an area, and they have a lot more industries and everything. So what are the chances of our country being able to make carbon neutrality by 2060?
I think they're very good.
Right.
China has invested heavily in the technology, and carbon-free electricity production, once you make electricity without releasing carbon dioxide, and that is possible using a range of existing technologies. But once you've done that, then that electricity can be used to supply industry more generally and also transportation. So the question is, can you decarbonize the electricity sector in time?
Yes.
How quickly can you do that? And that is a huge challenge. Essentially, we have today an industry which has been developed over the last 125 years. And all the electricity infrastructure that we have today has taken 125 years to get to where it is today. If we're to replace that with carbon-free forms of electricity, essentially what we have to do is to rebuild all of that. And we have to rebuild more than what we have today, because all of that electricity will then be needing to supply new forms of industry and new markets. So it is a huge challenge, and it's one of scale and it's one of pace. Can we do this in time? That's
right.
really
But
the question.
does Hong Kong has a role to play in the greater picture for the country to help to reaching the goal in 2060? Apart from us reaching 2050, do we have any goals that any roles that we can play?
Well, I think a key consideration for Hong Kong is we are needing to think of ourselves as part of a regional development.
Right.
We cannot think of just doing our job in Hong Kong and ignoring the region around us.
Right.
And where we locate our generating facilities, if we're looking at new technologies such as renewable energy with wind power, solar power, and nuclear power, we don't really have the space here in Hong Kong to to accommodate all of those. We will have to start thinking about bringing that power in from around us in the region.
I mean, we can't not talk about the topic of COVID. I mean, COVID has put a brakes on many development plans. It has, I mean, every country is fighting with all what they have to fight this epidemic. So has anything been stalled or delayed because of the epidemic? And any new strategy needs to be renegotiated, for example? Just want to know.
Well, I think one thing COVID has done is raise awareness of how fragile our economies are.
Yes.
And when you think about the impacts of climate change, which will really not only change the weather, it's much more than that, but it will change the availability of water. It will make land more scarce because of rising sea levels. And if you just think that COVID being a virus that no one had ever heard of 18 months ago, and just how much that has impacted our economies and our way of life. When you think about the impacts of climate change, this will be on a much greater and much more profound scale. So I think one thing COVID has done is really just made us more aware of the importance of dealing with climate change and the urgency.
All right, let's have a break and see you back soon. Welcome back to Straight Talk, and tonight we have Mr. Richard Lancaster, the chairman of the Business Environment Council and also the CEO of CLP Group. Richard, in the first part of the program, we talked about a few issues, in particularly on COVID. Just something came to my mind because of COVID and our changes in all our lives are that we are staying at home with much longer time, day and night, even working from home. Our children are studying at home. So I'm sure the power consumption is much higher. So how much has that changed our direction in terms of fighting the climate change?
Interestingly, power consumption has stayed about the same as pre-COVID. But
really?
what has changed is where that electricity is used. We're not using electricity in offices, but we're using that same amount of electricity in our homes. We're also seeing people using more electronic devices, and so data centers have been seeing a much higher usage, whereas we haven't been using restaurants or hotels as much, and so that's been down a bit. So it's the pattern of electricity usage that's changed. But I think one thing that has been changed is that we are not traveling internationally. Flights have certainly stopped or been cut back dramatically, and that has had an impact on carbon emissions from the transportation sector. So it has raised the awareness, I think, around the planet of just how much lifestyle will be affected if we are to become a carbon-free economy.
Yes. Let's go back to the next thing I'm sure all our audience will want to know. You mentioned earlier, electricity generation is one of the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emission, like up to 2/3. So that means the energy sector has a lot to play with this carbon neutrality initiatives we have. There are two major power companies in Hong Kong. You're one of them. So it's naturally, we know that it's going to need infrastructures, additional resources to do all these. What's your response to it? I mean, that means are you all responsible to it, or the government is going to help you to do it?
I believe that this is an important initiative that has to be led both by governments and by the business sector. No one party can really bring about the changes that are going to be needed on their own. So it does need both business and government to be working coherently together. Essentially, what we need to do is to build a new electricity grid. And the reason we have to do that is that the renewable energy, the nuclear power, all the carbon-free forms of electricity have to be running reliably before we can shut down the fossil fuel plants, the coal plants and the oil plants. So we have to have new infrastructure in place, get that working reliably, and then we can shut down the carbon-generating plants. And that requires careful planning. It requires coordination to make sure that all the infrastructure is in place. Every piece of the electricity chain has to be there, has to be running reliably, and that's where good coordination with governments is needed.
I must ask a question that hopefully you will answer me, because all the electricity tariffs will be increased, and as a Hong Kong person, all of us will have to shoulder part of the burden. How do you deal with the conflict of interest here? Because you are a power supply company, you're doing all the infrastructures. At the same time, I'm sure you have to maintain your profit. How do you strike the balance?
Well, that's a very important question, Eugene. But let me say that if you build infrastructure, in the electricity business, it has a very long life. So you're basically spreading that cost over decades. And if you can build that infrastructure over a long enough period of time, you can basically spread that cost out, and it doesn't impact electricity tariffs as much as people might fear. Now, another consideration is that the single biggest cost that we face in supplying electricity to Hong Kong is the amount of natural gas that we have to purchase. So it's the cost of buying the fuels, the coal, the oil, and the natural gas. All of that is the single biggest cost. If we're moving to carbon-free forms of electricity production, renewable energy doesn't come with a fuel bill. The fuel is free. It's the wind and the sunshine.
Yeah.
Nuclear power uses such a little amount of fuel that the cost of fuel is almost negligible in the cost of generating. And one of the technologies that we're very interested in is converting from natural gas to hydrogen. And hydrogen is carbon-free. And hydrogen can be produced very cost-effectively by using the surplus energy from wind farms and taking it through a technology called an electrolyzer, which is a very old, proven technology, and that can produce hydrogen, which can feed into our natural gas system. So with scale and over time, we can, I believe, manage the costs so that it doesn't make electricity unaffordable to our customers.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like all the power companies in Hong Kong are doing a lot of hard work to support the government. Can you ever say no at any stage of the negotiation? I mean, I assume the government will have close contact with the industry to making sure all this is practical, isn't it?
I would never. I mean, aside from it being government policy, it's the right thing to do. This is such an important issue for the planet. And from a perspective of sustainability, how could you possibly run a business that is going to cause harm to the planet? It just isn't sustainable.
Right.
The other side of the coin is that we should look at this as an opportunity for our business. If we can decarbonize quickly, not only are we saving the planet from a global issue of such proportions, but also it's a good thing for the electricity sector because there'll be more demand for our product. So having a clean, sustainable product is really what our business should be grabbing with both hands.
Yes. So for the whole society to be carbon neutral, I'm sure it's not just decarbonization of the energy sector. What is your view of, I mean, other industries such as transport that we mentioned earlier? I mean, there's air travel, sea travel, and also our cars, both private and industrial cars. What are your take on that?
Well, this is where technology and innovation will really play a role. We've seen in recent years the adoption of electric cars, and electric cars are not a new technology. This is actually a very old technology that's just been brought back into popularity. And we now feel quite comfortable. We see many electric vehicles on the road in Hong Kong, even more if you go into mainland China with electric buses, electric taxis, and more vehicles are converting across to electric. With innovation and technology, we'll see goods vehicles, we'll see buses, maybe even double-decker buses that we can see in Hong Kong, all using electricity. Now, when it comes to air travel and sea travel, the technology is already there for short distances. So some of our short regional applications, and in Hong Kong, our ferries and the short distances that they travel could all be powered either by electricity or potentially by by hydrogen.
Yes.
So the technology is there, and with innovation, we'll start to see more and more applications of carbon-free electricity to help decarbonize other sectors.
Yes. Another buzzing word is in my ear is actually it's called the renewable energy. If you look at, it's still very low in Hong Kong. I look at some of the reports. It said account for less than 1% of Hong Kong total energy usage. Is there something to address? Like the solar thing. What is your view? And like nuclear. Like to tell the audience about your thoughts on those renewable energy.
Well, Hong Kong does have some options for carbon-free electricity. Renewable energy has come down in cost so much that it is now the most competitive form of electricity production. It is cheaper to build renewable energy plants than it is to build fossil fuel plants. But in Hong Kong, we are always short of land, and renewable energy does require a lot of land. If you look at a country such as China, if China was to have all of its electricity provided by renewable energy, it would need to use about 2% of its land area and dedicate that to renewable energy. That should be manageable. Mm-hmm. In Hong Kong, if we were to dedicate 2% of our land use, we would only be able to generate about 2% of our electricity demand. Right. And even 2% in Hong Kong is going to be a challenge, given that we're a densely packed city.
With all the housing
issues. With all the housing. So yes. What we can do in Hong Kong is do our part. We launched a feed-in tariff scheme which encouraged people to put solar panels on their rooftops of their
in the news, yes.
Schools, factories, and houses. If they have a house in the new territories, it can all have a solar panel on it, and it's one of the most generous feed-in tariff schemes anywhere in the world. And there's been a huge take-up of that.
Okay.
The government is developing renewable energy facilities on its facilities. Reservoirs, for example, where you have large areas. So we can do what we can, but it will only be small. One thing, though, with wind technology is that by moving it from land to offshore, you can have bigger facilities that don't need large areas of land. Mm-hmm. So by putting wind turbines in the sea, you can generate quite large amounts of wind power and get away from the problem of land availability.
I'm sure our audience is going to ask you about the nuclear safety. With Fukushima still fresh in our minds, how risky is it? Very simple question.
Well, nuclear power has been around for decades. And if you look at the history of nuclear power, there has actually been relatively few incidents. But they are very high profile, and we know about them. We know about 3 Mile Island, yes. We know about Chernobyl, we know about Fukushima. But the industry is very well proven and has been running very reliably. There are over 400 nuclear reactors running around the world. And if you are developing a nuclear industry, you need to develop it on a scale that really makes it worthwhile. And that's where China, I think, has been very smart in developing an industry of scale, building it to the highest safety standards. They developed it later in the process. So what they have is very modern and very proven technology.
Right, Richard, thank you very much to talk about how climate change is to relevant to Hong Kong and all the issues about carbon neutrality. And hopefully our audience will start to have a better understanding. So we have a good week, and we see you next time.